This episode of BFC TV is brought to you by Polaroid.
So my name is Rhiannon Adam, and I'm about to go to space. Going around the moon on a lunar circumnavigation and then back to Earth. So it's about a week-long trip. So I'm a photographer, as you might have guessed by the fact I'm sitting here on this particular couch. So my background is really with kind of Polaroid film. And originally when I'd applied to go on this mission, I was drawing the parallels between kind of Edwin Land and his research into space and space technology and his kind of influence in the early days of the space program with Eisenhower. Right up until the fact that in 1972 when SX-70 came out, that was the last of the Apollo missions. And so like integral film had never made it, for instance. You had Edwin Land wandering around a factory, putting his hand into a pocket and pulling out something that looked like an iPhone, and he had this vision of a time when we would be using like photography as kind of as often as we use a pencil. And I think we've hit that point now. And instead of taking an iPhone, I'm going to go back to the old school and be working with film in space. Of course, anyone saying that, oh, you know, space feels like a natural fit seems like a ridiculous statement. You know, having said that, it does feel like quite a natural fit. I spend a lot of time, you know, working with remote communities, and so I spent time in the very remote corners of the Earth. And I suppose you can't have anywhere more remote than being on a space capsule in the middle of the black abyss. But also, you know, I grew up on a boat sailing around the world, and I was with my parents, you know, for years and years on end in a 42-foot steel bilge-keeled boat. And we were often, you know, in the middle of the ocean, crossing the Atlantic, and we wouldn't see anyone else. We would just be able to look up and see the stars. And so there is sort of a similarity about that kind of claustrophobia and that that everything that you're carrying with you is all that you have, you know, that sort of resilience factor. But, you know, I'm particularly interested in this gulf between fact and fiction and utopia and dystopia, and nothing encapsulates that like space. And it's such a historic moment. I think it's important that as part of this, that we're dealing with it like an artist residency, that we're actually processing the experience and translating that rather than us just becoming, I suppose, just the subject of the mission. We're kind of the authors of the mission, if you know what I mean. So I think there's that kind of grey area where you just don't want to be lost, I suppose. And I think just documenting it, you know, so yeah, I take pictures of the other crew. I'm sure there will be an element of that. I will do that for memento's sake. But I don't think that's particularly interesting because we've seen people in space before. That's not new. But what is new about this is sending artists to space, sending creatives to space. That has never been done before. So, you know, it's the way that we're reacting to that environment, it's the work that we produce, it's the way that we're thinking, the way that it changes us, the way that we can translate that experience of looking back at the Earth. That's what's powerful about this. Really, the most interesting part is how this changes and how we become, I suppose, these vessels for everyone's hopes and dreams. I think that's a fascinating and daunting prospect, and it's like a huge sense of responsibility. Even though my plan is to make work in space and to use analog technology, you know, and use wet processing in space. I mean, I want to be able to do things that they would have found difficult with the kind of lunar probes early on, and you know, there'll be lots of film. And I want to be able to process some of it there so I can make sure it comes out. It doesn't get destroyed by the radiation. You know, I'm looking at doing things like having hundreds of pinhole cameras and, you know, being able to record the light and how different that is. I'm not so interested in this like very literal documentation because we've got telescopes that are incredibly powerful these days. I don't need to be the one who's taking pictures out of a window of the surface of the moon. You know, so I use a lot of pack film, and pack film is relatively easy to shoot in space because it's down to you pulling through the camera. But shutters need to be adapted, resistance, springs. You know, there's a lot of small technical details that have to be thought out. So this whole lead up is all of that preparation. It's all of that talking to people who are engineers, talking to people who build things, talking to people who hack things, you know, figuring that stuff out. Well, I'm the only woman on the crew, which is, it feels like a lot of responsibility in a way. There haven't been that many women in space, and so I think that that's a huge responsibility because there's part of me that wants to be representative. And then like being an out queer person in space, that's a very interesting position to find myself in, because most of the countries that have sent people to space or are sending people to space are not particularly friendly towards my identity. Space has always been quite symbolic to queer people because it's been this blank canvas where there are no borders, there are none of these rules, there are no laws against our existence. So it's been quite symbolic, but at the same time, it's been a bit of an exclusion zone. I think being who I am and being open about it, that has been, it's not been a difficult thing because I'm very much, out, and if people want to ask me a question, I'll be honest with them. But at the same time, I do go to countries in the world where it's now not safe for me to go. So it was a very conscious decision to out myself in this way, but I felt that if I didn't do that, I was going to be part of the problem, not part of the solution. So I've relinquished some of my freedom to make the work that I like to make with that statement. And you weigh up everything in life, don't you, about the pros and the cons. And in the end, I decided that this was an opportunity to, I suppose, be visible and to be like a normal human that people can relate to and say, hey, you know what? Rhiannon's not so bad. Therefore, this other person can't be so bad. And hopefully that, by small degree, that changes things.